Welcome to Talent Titans, the podcast where we bring you entrepreneurs and leaders from the global staffing industry. I'm your host, Suki Sodi. Now let's jump right on in and welcome today's Titan.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Talent Titans. Today, we're not talking recruiting per se, but we're talking something very, very important and closely related. We're talking about EOR. And on that note, I'm going to bring in my guest, Francis Larson, founder of Asen. Francis, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for being willing to share your pearls of wisdom. Look, who is Asen? Who are you? Who is Francis?
So I'm Francis Larson. I'm CEO and founder of Ascen. We're a Y Combinator-backed employer of record for staffing companies. So we've been around for a few years now, and we exclusively work with staffing and recruitment agencies. We act as the employer of their workers. We handle timesheets, onboarding, payroll, invoicing, funding, everything to run a back office of a staffing agency.
Mm-hmm.
And we help people that are in the recruitment business focus on what they're good at, which is like finding clients and candidates and leaving everything else to us. And we do it in a nice all-in-one white label platform that really delights the users and allow people to grow very quickly.
Fantastic. So let's start with maybe a little bit of an obvious question, but what is an EOR? Because there's a whole confusion about what you do, when to use you, when not to use you, and what the service is. So what is an EOR?
You know, in a traditional staffing scenario, so a traditional staffing company, let's say you wanted to run a staffing company and you find a client, let's say it's Amazon, and you want to place a warehouse worker at Amazon. Traditionally, you would have to become the employer of the warehouse worker. And so you would have to onboard them and run payroll for them and, handle all the HR issues, be registered, taxes, all of that stuff. And all the responsibility of being an employer would fall on you. And so employers of record like us have come along, and we take over those responsibilities of being an employer. We become the legal employer of the workers. We handle all the registrations, all the HR compliance, all the taxes, all the insurance, all the benefits, everything to do with an employer. Like if you get sued for something, if somebody makes a complaint to the agencies, any kind of relationship or issue that could come up with being an employer, we handle. And this way, working as a staffing company has really come about in the last 10 years or so. And we happen to be a very tech-enabled version of that. But employer of record has been around for a little bit. There's an older concept called PEO, it's called a professional employer organization. And what that is, it's kind of like an employer of record, but it's what's called a co-employer, meaning they're a partial employer. They handle some taxes, some insurance, payroll, sometimes benefits. A lot of the responsibility for employment falls on the staffing agency. We come in as an employer of record, a full employer of record, and we take on all of the responsibilities. You still can't do illegal stuff, but we take on the bulk, virtually everything when it comes to employment.
Okay, so one of the misconceptions I hear on EOR is, yes, you're the employer of records, because I've had a lot of people say to me, oh, but the revenue doesn't get counted as my company revenue. It goes against the EOR revenue when they're looking at selling and things like that. Am I correct in saying no? Because now, whether you're selling to a VC firm or whatever, they know what an EOR is. They understand the whole model, and you don't lose the revenue allocation when it comes to being acquired.
Yeah, so that comes up if we're funding. So
Yep.
So in any kind of staffing relationship, you always need funding. So
Yep.
because clients pay in net 30 days or 60 days, whenever it takes
If you're lucky.
time. Yeah, and you got to cover the payroll for the workers in the meantime. So staffing inherently has a cash flow problem.
Mm-hmm.
You could use factoring and stuff like that, sometimes an asset-based lending facility. But if you're really new, sometimes you can't do that. And so you might use us. Most of our customers do this, and there's several employer records who do this. And so we provide funding. And what that means is we are sending the invoices to the clients, and the invoices have our name on it. And sometimes, like you're saying, people think oh, this is no longer my revenue.
Yeah.
This is the revenue of the employer of record. I'm not going to give like accounting advice, especially
Yeah.
not in Canada, but generally speaking, the revenue is not ours. So we are an agent, we're an order taker. We're not setting the price. The top line number, we don't report as our revenue.
Mm-hmm.
It's a factor into how we calculate our ultimately what our fee take is.
Yep.
But we don't report it as our revenue. And so generally staffing firms will report it as their revenue. Even if our name is on the invoice and we're collecting it, because we're an agent, typically under GAAP, we wouldn't be the one who has that revenue. So this is something that you shouldn't rely on this. You should talk to your accountants to deal with this. And this is like something that's very important. But it doesn't really matter for an acquisition. Like what acquisitions, like if you're talking about acquisitions, and we've had customers who've been bought,
Uh-huh.
they're going to look at EBITDA.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how you characterize the top line. Like those are vanity metrics. Those are like the reality is you're still going to be able to report the top line with us. But what the acquisition is going to come down to is likely EBITDA. Everything
Mm-hmm.
is based on EBITDA multiples. So that's earning before interest, taxation, depreciation, amortization. So that like what you're actually earning as a business is what acquirers care about,
Yeah.
and that's what they're going to base their multiple on. So like all this stuff on the top end, like how much revenue you do, it's sort of irrelevant. What matters is like, are you a profitable company?
Yeah. And it blows my mind how many people focus so much on that top line. Yeah, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not important at all, right? But you know what? I've seen companies with really strong top lines, and you filter it down and you're like, what? Is this what, or lost money and stuff like that? And I've seen other companies, businesses, okay, top line, but when you look at the bottom line, the ratio, right? Because
Oh yeah,
ultimately that's what people are paying for when they're acquiring you.
yeah. Like your profitability, like your efficiency as a company. People don't understand this. Like you might be doing, especially like when people are doing VMS or MSP deals. So they're like if you're going really low markups, or you're working with a VMS, or you're working with like third parties that are intermediating between you and the client, you might be doing a ton of revenue, but you might
Yeah.
be fundamentally unprofitable. Even though you're doing $100 million of
Yep.
sales, you can't make any money, and you're kind of running in place. Yeah, I think revenue. It's like you need to be able to recruit in a profitable way. This is something that the talent platforms have done a really good job at. Like they really focus on like their costs. Like okay, how
Mm-hmm.
many like recruiters versus like how much money we're spending to recruit for the jobs, and they go really granular in the unit economics. And a lot of times, recruitment firms, staffing agencies, they don't necessarily, especially if they're high growth, they might not optimize in the same way, and they chase the revenue. But if you're getting revenue that's no good, your markups are bad, your clients are turning over, like you can't keep clients, forget it. There's no point of the whole point of this is to make profit
Money.
when it comes down to it.
Well, here's the thing. Last time I checked, no bank gave you a loan or a mortgage based on your top line. They want to know what they want, that P&L. They want to see what that EBITDA looks like, right? And that's what the top line doesn't buy you your car, your house, put the kids at school and all the rest of it. It's what's left afterwards. But you do make a really valid point about how people chase the MSPs, VMSs, and the margins are so low, right? You're almost paying them to do business with you.
Oh, it's terrible. It's
Yeah.
terrible, terrible, terrible. I don't know why people do it. I mean, sometimes you got to do it. Some industries like healthcare, there's no way around it with hospitals. But otherwise, it's very difficult. Like we see this all the time. This is like you should focus enough on your specialty that you have, and find a way where you can have markups that are sufficiently high to run your business. Like chasing deals, chasing any business, going outside your specialty, that's going to push down that all you can compete on is price at that point, and you just can't earn any money. The customers that we see that do the best, and we have like a broad index of customers. So we're working with like light industrial and healthcare and life sciences and IT. And so it's kind of like the S&P 500
Yep.
of staffing in America, because we have so many customers over across all the United States. So it's a good broad index. And we see that the ones that do the best, they are super focused. They're really good at getting direct clients, like getting direct contracts with clients. Like they find a way around the MSP. They find a way to get a direct contract. So they're really specialized, and they're really specialized on how they recruit and who they recruit. So like it might be, and I've used this example in the past, but it might be like a certain type of biotech startup and they recruit a certain type of role for biotech startups. And maybe that's contract, but they really narrow into that. They get into the community and they maintain these like really high markups. Or in more commercial areas, it might be like nursing assistants for schools, like public schools. And that's like what they focus on. Those are the best customers, for us at least, and the ones that grow the fastest. They know what their niche is. They don't try to like chase deals, and they have a specialty that enables them to have high markups, and that ultimately translates into having like a good bottom line.
Well, think about it. When you're trying to be jack of all trades, you're an expert in nothing. So when you don't have a specialization, now even if that is light industrial, that is all you do, you are the go-to people for forklift truck drivers, for argument's sake. The client sees the value. When you don't have a differentiator, your only differentiator becomes price, right? So the margins are just driven and are driven to such a point where, as I said, you're paying people to do business with you. I do like the fact that you mentioned the broad types of clients that you guys are working with, right? So you get a really good 10, 20, 30,000 foot view of our industry, which is amazing. So what are some of the other mistakes you see recruitment companies make then?
I mean, I think one big thing we see permanent shops, so like direct hire recruitment agencies. And maybe they have like 20 recruiters or something like that. They're doing like 5, 10, $20 million of perm revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And they think to themselves, okay, I want to exit this business one day. So I need some contract. I need some temp.
Recurring revenue. Yeah.
I need some reoccurring revenue, right? So they're like, okay, I'm going to set up a contract division. And what they do is they go out, they don't know how to recruit in that space, let's say. And they go out and find a head of contract. And the head of contract, they hire, it's going to be a big windfall for them. 6 months go by, no new business.
Yeah.
Nothing. It doesn't work. And they've wasted, I don't know, like, $100,000 on this person and nothing. And they do it again, same thing. And what we found is that like folks, like they have to learn how to sell contracts themselves. Like the founders have to learn how to do it themselves, like either at their former employer,
Yep.
like, and they have to learn it on the job, or they got to go out on their own and learn how to sell contract. It's a different sale, it's a different speed. You have to find out like what markets work for a contract. Like there's certain areas that just don't make sense for contract work. Like certain types of software engineers are never going to be like external employees, really, like not really. And then some are always external employees, like ERP software, like
Yep.
SAP and NetSuite and stuff like that. So like you have to find out what structurally makes sense for a contract. You have to find out like how to do the sale, like who to talk to in the organization, like how to price. Like you have to, as an owner, have to figure that out. It's very hard to outsource your learning. Very,
Yep.
very hard to do it. And so I think that's a huge mistake that we see from like newer agencies. That's a big, big mistake.
Yeah,
And there's lots of other.
Yeah, they're trying to manage something they don't understand then.
Yeah.
Right? And you don't understand the customer journey, the candidate journey. And you're right. I remember years ago advising a company. I was looking for the head of their tech, and they were a general staffing. And I couldn't initially, we got there in the end, but I had to say to them, stop hiring this person with a temp mindset. Right? Because they're like, well, and because they wanted to do that person to do contracting, tech contracting, and they're general staffing, temp, like a commercial agency, right? And they were like, yeah, but sales is sales. That's not necessarily true, right? And then you've got to have the infrastructure and the process to be able to then, when the quote unquote sale has come in, then you've got to have the infrastructure to be able to deliver on that.
Yeah.
Waiting 2 weeks for a CV ain't going to cut it.
Yeah, it's totally different. I think though, like if you're gonna do the head of contract approach, either you gotta learn it or you gotta work with someone who you have to find the right person, and that is
Or
really
acquire.
yeah, or you have to acquire. Like
Yeah.
you really, it's very hard to like train somebody up on that. I think you have to like find somebody who's really good, and those people are kind of hard to find. It's hard to find people who are gonna leave like their shop and go to your shop and be good. Like finding that person, very, very difficult. Like if you can do it, great. but it's hard to do unless you are like really keyed in.
And you got to play the long game because it takes time building up a contractor revenue base,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
take
you
time.
can't give them 3-6 months.
There's another thing about contract revenue is I don't know how true this is, but I know like from our experience, and I've heard this sort of number thrown around, is that like 20% of your clients are going to churn. They're going to leave for temporary work. It's by nature, it's temporary, right?
Yeah.
So clients are gonna leave you at a very like significant rate. 20% are going to go away, like something
Wow.
around there.
That's a
Like that's a
high
high
number.
end. But like even if it's 10%,
Yeah.
you've got to be growing 20% to really make up for that.
Yep.
So it's one of these things where it's like you have to understand that this is like it's like you have to keep moving, you have to keep selling. The firms that do poorly that we see in our on our platform at least, and we work with folks doing over $100 million, doing down to like 500 grand in sales a year. So
Yep.
we have like a big spectrum, and there's some folks they get to a certain number of weekly sales,
Yep.
they like stop selling. They like think and you die like that. You can't do it. Or they get one big client and they stop selling. It's like no, you always have to be growing. You have
Because
to
they
be.
put all their resources onto getting that one client.
Yeah, and they think they've made it. They think, oh,
Yep.
this is good. This is going to produce cash. No, it's all an illusion. Like use the cash now that you're okay. Take your profits, whatever, but continue to grow the business. And the folks that really struggle, they somehow they get to a certain point, they stop selling, they stop investing in growth, or they get one really big client, and it's like, oh, great, this is a $25 million program, and all of a sudden they stop their sales skills atrophy
Yeah.
and they stop being able to acquire new business and they become order takers and you just can't do it and that's the biggest thing we like in addition to like trying to outsource your learning like
Yep.
getting stuck you gotta and this is like and this goes back to why we think EOR employer of record is so important. It's like it enables you to only look forward. Like we're in the back, we're the back office. Like this is just details. Like if you get stuck on this minutia, you're not going to continue to grow. All your focus should be on like delivering for your clients and growing your business. Like all of this stuff about am I registered in like Delaware or do I have workers comp in like Texas or whatever, or hey, what about this like weird lawsuit in California? Like all of that stuff has nothing to do with delivering for your clients.
No.
They just don't, the clients do not care about that stuff. Like, and it's not going to help you grow. So like our vision with employer of record is like, how can we get these staffing firms to grow very quickly, to grow very compliantly, and like really flourish as a business. And yeah, once you get to $50 million in sales, then you can worry about like hiring stuff in house and like saving money. You get your
Yep.
CFO and try to shave off like savings. But before then, it's like you haven't even cracked the surface. It doesn't matter how narrow your niche is. Like $50 million is so low. Like you can worry about cost savings later if you're trying to build stuff in house. Like just worry about growth, worry about recruiting, worry about like what actually a staffing firm should do, which is finding candidates. Like forget all this like ridiculous law stuff. There's so many laws, there's so many registrations, there's so many
And they're
things
changing all the time.
changing constantly. Like look at what's happening right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like how can you predict it? It's just a waste of time to think about it.
But the other thought that was going through my mind as you were talking was a lot of agencies, they get this big deal on $25 million deal. They divert the resources there, and then they divert the funding from the day-to-day cash flow to get that account up and running, which then further depletes everything. When they've got an EOR model, that's going to help them. That's going to help them scale without damaging and diluting their core business. So, talking of scaling, new markets, whether people are coming into the US right now, it's risky from a compliance perspective, especially the US. I always say it's like 50 different countries, right? With when it comes to compliance and things like that. How do you support businesses looking to expand without them having to get caught up in that complex local laws? Do you have somebody that's an expert in all 50 states? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, so our team has to be an expert in all 50 states, and I think we do a pretty good job at that. But yeah, so like the problem is if you're coming into the U.S., like let's say you're coming from Canada, and our specialty is really the U.S. That's where we
Yep.
really shine. But we have a lot of folks coming from UK, a lot of folks coming from Canada. UK is the biggest outside the US. And there's a lot of things that are different about the US. So, like, the one big difference is at will employment is very different. So, that makes it easier to do contract staffing in the US. So, like, you can just you can terminate whenever for any reason, unless it's like prohibited by law, which is like
Yep.
discrimination, stuff like that. But that is a big difference. So, like, you would think that that should make like staffing like compliance really easily. But the problem is, like you said, is there are all these other laws, and so you have to follow federal rules when it comes to employment law, like overtime federal laws, exemption from overtime federal laws, all sorts of other things on a federal level, and then you also have the state level laws, and sometimes those kind of conflict to some degree. Sometimes the states are very strict, some are not strict. Some have laws, like California has all sorts of laws that are very different from other states. So you might get some states that have daily overtime, which is common in Canada, but in the US it's not. You might have daily overtime. You might have meal break penalties. You might have like some other weird like paid leave you have to do in some cities and not some others. And so there's this patchwork of laws, which makes it really difficult. So what we enable companies to do is you can come in, you don't have to register if you don't want, you don't have to like set up an entity in the US, and you can operate in any state really without any sort of knowledge of how the HR laws work. Okay, you can't discriminate. You don't
Yep.
want to do that. So like, but like if you're coming from the UK or Canada, like honestly, the sort of harassment, discrimination stuff, it's so similar that you're not going to run afoul. Maybe some things like you can't talk about your past earnings in some states. Like there's some things that you might, not might want to, be careful about. But when it comes to compliance, like an EOR, an employer of record, will allow you to expand rapidly in the US without having like even an entity, without getting registered, without having insurance. You can pretty much operate as a national US staffing firm from day one. And that's just like a really powerful thing. You can think,
Yep.
I have the infrastructure to work in every state under my brand, and I don't have to worry about any of this stuff, sans some frontline recruiting things you don't want to run afoul of. But for the most part, you can operate as if you are a large multi-$100 million staffing firm from day zero, which is a really powerful thing. And I think that's one of the reasons that the employer of record model has really picked up.
For the Brits, right? It's true because it doesn't matter whether you're recruiting in London, Manchester, Bristol, wherever, Reading, wherever. The law is the law. Okay? That is the law. No
Yeah.
ifs and buts about it. If you can't do something here, you can't do it there. Right? Or Newcastle going further north, right? That's it. It's one law. You don't have to be like, whereas US you got 50, right? So that's just a big shock for the Brits that are coming over to do it, because you don't even think about it when you're doing your planning, right? You're like, yeah, where's our market and stuff like that. But you're not sitting there thinking, okay, right, so when we're working here, we can do this, but we can't do this over here. It's the polar opposite, right? So I
Yeah.
think especially for the Brits, an EOR is certainly as an entry point, regardless of how big you are. I think it's a safety net that I certainly wouldn't do it without.
So what's interesting about the UK is that they have all these umbrella companies. So
Yep.
like nobody is really an employer of the staffing workers. It's all
Yeah.
through umbrellas.
Yep.
Unless it's like light industrial, like low level
Yep.
work, but like everything's through umbrella. So the UK companies are using a model that's very similar to employer of record. Like nobody wants to be an employer because there's so much risk. So they use the umbrella for a lot of jobs, and so they're used to this kind of model. The Canadians have it. What's interesting about Canada, it is actually very similar. It's just on a smaller scale.
Smaller scale.
So like you still have the provinces, and the laws are like are very similar to California laws. It's very very similar.
Yep.
So like if you are good at operating in Canada, you're actually it's like very similar to California, like
Yep.
daily overtime, some like vacation stuff. Like it's very similar. So like I think intuitively for Canadians coming into this, you should have a better understanding. The ESA, like employment standards stuff, is very similar. You're just having a
But only
big.
for one state, California,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. So if like but the point is that like you already understand as a Canadian working in the Canadian market that there's a lot of provinces that they're all going to have their own unique laws. That sometimes some states require like a license, some don't. Like Ontario,
Yep.
you need a license, but
Yep.
it's same thing in other states now. Like Illinois, you need a staffing license. Like in New Jersey, like there's all these rules now. Like so, it is structurally similar. It just 10 times as
Yeah.
many issues you need to worry about. So I think it's a really nice model for Canadians to come in. But I don't think they should be afraid. I think that a lot of people think the US is like so scary for certain things. But in reality, it's worse going the other way. Like it's for us like employing in other
Oh,
countries.
you'd get into trouble here quite easily, just if you kept the mindset of the local, unless you're California, I guess, right?
Right.
But you would, because you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah, no,
So
that's true. And that's the scariest thing is you
yeah.
don't know where it's going to hurt. So there is like this educational process of like, okay, here are the things that matter. Like we'll take care of it. Here's some things that you might want to think about. But like the reality is that a lot of Canadian like employment laws are very similar to like some of the strictest US states.
Yeah,
So
it definitely. But I do want to pick up on getting into trouble here, right? I want to pick this one up because I see this over and over again. Misclassification. Okay, I'm seeing it come up over and over again, and that is going to make or break your business. Again, you guys are the experts at that. So if I look at cases like Uber, right? No, all our drivers are independent contractors. And no, when it went to court. So how does a company like yours help ensure that compliance piece, but still helping maintain that flexible model, right? How do you ensure that? I know we've spoken, you've got guys that do each and every branch. Is it your software just ain't gonna let somebody class somebody as a contractor when they're not?
So one of the really hard parts about independent contractor classification in the U.S. is that there's very few bright line rules.
Okay.
It's usually in most states it's like a sum of the facts. It's a lot of factors and it could go either way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult to classify somebody as an independent contractor versus an employee. And so a lot of the gig platforms, for instance, they just like did 1099, they
Yep. That's it.
for everybody.
Yeah.
And increasingly, they haven't really, the federal government hasn't really done anything. So I think there's like zero risk on a federal, like not zero, but it's very low risk on a federal level for
Yep.
misclassification. Almost nothing. It's crazy. It shouldn't be the case. People just don't enforce the law the IRS doesn't, and the Department of Labor only if there's overtime do they enforce, but they don't otherwise. Like reclassification, they really don't enforce on a federal level. It's really the states that have started enforcing
Yeah.
against the gig platforms and other type of staffing companies. Like in Colorado, you might like they've gone after for not paying sick time, so like accrued sick time, like it's a very strange vector to go after these staffing or gig platforms, but that's how they've done it. In other states, maybe it's like SUI stuff, state unemployment insurance they've gone after, or overtime is the biggest one, not paying people overtime. But it's becoming like the states are the ones driving this. And so
Okay.
increasingly, the states are like enforcing, and we're seeing more and more people, like especially gig platforms, like coming to us and saying, "Hey, I need everyone in California to be at W-2 tomorrow." And this is how we have to operate in certain states. But what we see is it's still a patchwork. Like some states don't really enforce IC laws; they just do not care, and then other ones do.
Yet.
So yeah,
Yet.
it's coming, but a
Yeah.
lot of them don't. Like a lot of them just like don't have a. But it's slowly happening more and more. Especially the Democratic states are becoming more aggressive enforcement, and that trend is happening regardless of what's happening at a federal level.
Yep.
So that's something that people don't understand. It's like the federal stuff is not super correlated. It might be even inversely correlated. Like the lower regulation goes on a federal level, the states hike up the regulation to sort of fill the void. This is like a very common thing that's happening, and that's counterintuitive, especially from folks outside the US. But yeah, like for a firm like us, what we do is when people submit a job to us, we do a classification. So if they try to submit an independent contractor, we have a survey, we put it through, we have a bunch of questions, we find out if there's like an entity involved, if there's not, what kind of job they're doing, what kind of, are they, can they control their own work? Do they control their schedule? Can they outsource their work? Can they work with multiple clients? We have like this whole thing.
Yep.
And then we put a classification. And so we tell people like whether they can do a certain assignment as independent contractor. And so some industries have more independent contractors than others. Like, there's life sciences, highly paid, $400 an hour people. A lot of them are independent contractors. And then
Yep.
you have some in IT, it's like 50-50 sometimes. In other areas, it's lower. But one thing that we do not do is for like gig work, low paid work, that's like in-person type work, we never are classifying it as independent contractor.
Because it's not.
Yeah.
Right?
People have no power. Like employment laws are set up to protect people who don't have power, like
Yep.
who can't enter into a contract with you in a fair way. And if you're low paid, and so that's what the laws are to protect. So I don't think it's even possible to have a low paid independent contractor with how the laws are in. It just the powers to imbalance, like it just doesn't make sense. And so like we like even in healthcare, like there's all these 1099 independent contractor platforms, and it's just like it is such a gross violation of the intention of the laws to have like a nursing assistant like putting IVs and like they're they're working in a hospital. For them to be an independent contractor is just
Wow.
so absurd and so illegal that like it is insane to me that has been allowed to go on. It's insane. It's criminal. It's like I think it might be criminal actually. Like that's been allowed. It's insane to me.
But the
It's utterly
governments,
insane.
the states are going to, you know what? Doesn't matter whether we're talking Canada or the US or wherever, UK, pick your choice. When they start running out of money and they need more money, for whatever reason, they come after our industry, right? And then they're like, oh,
It's that.
oh, and that's it, right? You are buggered then, right? Because you know what? They're going to come in, and it's your risk tolerance. I get that, right? I'm somebody like my risk tolerance is really, really high on a lot of things. Stuff like this, I don't have. They're just like that, right? But I have heard of people trying to put um, general laborers, workers, minimum wage people as an independent contractor. They have no control over that.
That's crazy.
Right. And we were talking about selling your business and, the revenue allocation. That's probably worse because when you want to go and sell your business, and if you have misclassified, that's a huge chunk of money to sort that out if it could be sorted out.
Oh, you can't sort it out. It's like if you're trying to sell your criminal enterprise. It's like, sorry, you can't sell it. There's no getting out of it. You have to use that cash for something else. You're
You
gonna
go
have to go.
find another criminal and say, hey, do
Yeah,
you want to buy
it's
my?
crazy, and that's why these platforms, they don't sell. Like I don't know who sell. Nobody.
Yeah.
Like no one's gonna buy that. So like, and some of the things these platforms do is like I've talked to like some of the CFOs, and they'll tell me like they'll just say that, okay, we raised like $100 million and the risk is this, and here's what the fine is going to be, and we're just not going to comply. And they'll just straight up tell you that. They'll tell you that
Wow.
they've done the math and they think that it's like not worth it. And you only can do that if you have like a big war chest. But
Yep.
like other folks, like the fines can be devastating. Like you can get in a lot of trouble if you don't pay overtime. Like you go to jail. Like some like there's some stuff that if you don't do,
It's
if you
just
like,
not worth it.
it's not worth it. Like you shouldn't do it. Like there's some industries it's common where people are getting highly paid, but for like the low wage workers, and what's happening now though is the enforcement agencies are going after the clients. So the staffing agency is kind of getting off the hook, or the platform's off the hook, but they're going after the clients, and so the clients are now mandating that the staffing platforms are using W-2s, and so basically the boards of these clients are like, hey, I don't want to be doing this, like we're not shielded from this, and they're forcing.
Yeah, because before they were protected, it was the agency's fault. Bill 27 here is along those similar lines. If the agency fails, the company is liable, and you can't use an agent. And if you're an end user, a company, you can't use an agency that does not have a license. Ignorance is not an excuse anymore, right? So
Yeah.
it makes it even. And look, you could go and set up all of this internally in your branch, bypass somebody like yourselves. But I'm sitting here and thinking, oh my God, the cost, the financial investment you would have to make, and it's almost a blind leading the blind because you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah, it's a risky area. Like it's something that I think, and I'm being a little bit hyperbolic on some of these things. I think that the reality is that the unfortunate reality is that enforcement is inconsistent,
Yep.
and so it's driven a lot of firms to be like unsure of how to go about it. And so just the bigger companies now are realizing that, hey, we're going to take a little bit more of a conservative stance. So like big enterprises, if you're talking like F1000, like Fortune 1000 companies, they've always been concerned about this because they have so much risk. And it's just going down the chain. Like people are realizing, you know what, maybe we shouldn't, we should look into if our staffing provider is classifying people correctly. Like, we should do that. And it's leveling the playing field. Like a lot of the light industrial staffing firms have been destroyed, like in the US, because of these misclassifying platforms. They just, like, if you don't have to pay taxes, if you don't have to pay 15% burden, your price is going to be 15% lower. And anyone who's paying taxes
Yeah.
or workers' comp or all this stuff, they're going to be driven out of business. Like there's no way you can compete like that. So I think the market is changing and it's shifting, and we see these platforms coming over to EORs, and we think it's going to keep happening, but it's difficult for them to do. They have a hard time with it, and sometimes it's like, hey, we're just going to make way less money, and I think that's really hard, really, really hard to, like, they say that this quote that if you can't convince a person of something, that their job depends on not understanding.
Not understanding. Yeah. Yeah.
Like if
But
you're
that
making
doesn't
like,
stand up in a court of law.
yeah, but if you're like, I'm making $20 million, and if I do the right thing, if I do the correct thing, I make $10 million. It's so hard. You just, like, the contortions that people do, and we can move on from this topic, but yeah,
No,
we just
people use it as ignorance, right? They're like, oh, I didn't know. Well, I'm sorry that you may not have known, but the court doesn't care about that. When they decide, and not only that, before we move on, when they start ripping this part of your business apart, they're ripping the whole thing, right? And anybody that knows me, I always say never invite the taxman and government into your business.
Oh yeah, you don't want complaints.
Yeah.
This is another thing that people like should understand about employer of record. It kind of doesn't matter if you're right, if you're compliant. It matters, like, do the workers feel that they were mistreated?
Yeah.
Even if you're right, if they go to the agency, if they do a lawsuit, that's so expensive. It opens up so many problems. Like, you really want to have happy workers. You want
Yep.
to be doing the compliant thing, but you also want happy workers. And so we found that, like, there's cases where we're on the right side of the law, but, like, the reality is you have to make the worker happy, or if they're confused, like,
Candidate experience.
and an experience, like, and that's hard to do when you're working in so many different jurisdictions. It's very difficult. Sometimes you like, we've seen this, like, people don't realize, oh, I have to pay sick time in New York State. Like, yeah, you have to pay sick time in New York State. There's no way around it. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. You can't deny it. You can't try to pretend somebody's not, like, you have to do it. And this is one thing that, if a candidate feels that they were denied something, and it's really, really bad, even if you're technically right, like, it's really bad. So, like,
Yeah.
that's an area of advising that we find is you want to make sure that the candidates are happy, that they understand what they're getting into, and dealing with these, like, difficult compliance
Well,
situations.
you want that candidate to turn up tomorrow, next day, next day, next day, right? So you got to keep them happy. Look, I know we're running out of time, but I've got one last question for you. 2025, looking ahead, your crystal ball. What do you see as the biggest economic shift or regulations, whatever, that's going to impact workforce management in the US, and how should companies prepare?
So one big one is employment authorization is becoming, like, a really important thing.
Okay.
The I-9 in the U.S. It's really important. It used to be no enforcement whatsoever. Just everyone looked the other way. Did not matter. No one got enforced against unless it was, like, a blatant thing. But now I-9 compliance is a bigger deal. So, like, I think that's going to be really important. The U.S. is caring a lot more about whether somebody's authorized to work in the U.S. And
Yep.
this just wasn't getting enforced. So that's, like, a big thing. So I think you have to be like thinking about that, especially in folks who are in light industrial, like certain wages, certain types of work that have that kind of that workforce. You just have to be buttoned up on your compliance. So that's one thing that's happening. I think the economic uncertainty, it's this weird thing. We see staffing going up, but then we also have this countervailing force of uncertainty, around the tariffs and things like that. It's very uncertain right now. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think government, like the people who rely on government contractors who are staffing into that, are going to have a difficult time. I think that like certain areas are really hot, like in AI, anything touching AI is like really hot. Everyone knows that. Like one thing that's really cool, we see these staffing companies that exclusively staff to AI companies.
Yep.
And I think that's going to become a bigger area. It's like,
Yep. I can see that.
right? Like, and I think that, like, I think people are, it's early. You mentioned before, not on this call, but you mentioned a scale AI. They're like
Yep.
they're like, that's effectively a staffing company.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and they're called different things. So like, I think the market's changing. I think remote work is changing. People are going to office more. It's like a little bit changing of like what people are doing there. We see weird life sciences stuff like popping up. But a lot of it is like we see that there's a certain amount of uncertainty and change. And another thing that's really interesting, I think people are having to be a lot more creative selling. I think that is really the big thing that I see in our customer base and then the staffing firms we talk to is that the good ones, you can't just pick up the phone and send emails anymore. It doesn't work. Automation and AI have ended that. It does not work. People are getting scam calls all day long. You can't do that anymore. You have to do creative stuff like podcasts or content or conferences or building up communities or hosting your own events or like just producing stuff that's valuable to your niche. And you have to be super focused. Like you can't say to a client anymore, oh, we do everything, we're just like really good. Like you can't say that. You have to be like, nope, we only focus on your thing. Here's 16 different case studies of why this works. And oh, by the way, I'm friends with everybody in the industry in this particular focus area. So that's like a big change, is like the effect of AI on the industry is changing the way people have to sell because of it just drowned out everything. And then I think something else that's happening, which is I think starting to happen is and this is an unfortunate belief we have, is that AI recruitment tools and AI enabled software for recruiting agencies is meaning that some agencies are able to operate on a much higher scale with a smaller team because of AI type stuff.
Efficiencies as well.
It's super efficient. The problem, what's happening is I think because of the way staffing firms are always trying to compete on price, I think what's happening is it's driving down the margin. So like some super hyper efficient firms are just saying, oh, I'll do it for 30% markup. And they go, because they're using AI to recruit, they don't need to pay out these huge percentages to the recruiters. So we see the savings, and this is just really, I'm sorry, but we see the savings going to the clients. And the reality is that you have to start adopting AI tools yourself. It's kind of like an arms race, unfortunately. You got to do it. If you don't do it, you might be left behind. And
you will be left behind, though. That's the problem.
Yeah, and it's not like I wish I could say, oh, it's allowing people to just print money because they can keep their margin high. The reality is that there's like 4 new competitors now that are like just they're competing on the price and automation. And so you either got to go really up market and go really niche, or you really got to start adopting like AI-based tools, like try to become an AI-driven organization, or you're going to get outcompeted.
But the margins are coming down, and base salaries and things, minimum wage and stuff like that's going up, right? So unless you can keep, it is. It's like everything else, right? AI, automation, everything. It helps. It's a tool. But people have forgotten that, you know what, we've got to also do the value add piece. So therefore, you're competing on price. It's that fair piece coming in as well, right? Hey, look, and this has been fantastic. Look, people want to get a hold of you. You're going to be here in Canada in a couple of weeks. Couple of weeks.
That's right.
At the Staffing Summit. So if people want to chat with you whilst you're there, what's the best way for them to book into your calendar, so to speak?
I don't know. We can give a link. We can email me.
Send me the link and I'll put it
Yeah.
in the show notes. Okay. And for those that are listening to this and there's some of my UK clients audience thinking, we're going to make, or even in the US itself, right? So they've got, I don't know, they're in Texas and they thinking of doing California and they don't have all the compliance talent internally. How should they get hold of you?
I think either using my link or emailing me, francis@ascen.com. LinkedIn's the best. Just
Okay.
find me on LinkedIn. We're a very, very responsive organization. So find us on LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn, and happy to chat about any of these things about coming in, expanding, staffing, whatever.
This has been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you next month at the Canadian Staffing Summit, because you know what? What's happening today would have evolved into something else by then. We could probably do a completely new podcast by the
Yeah,
time.
probably have to do a new podcast.
Yeah, it's changing so fast. Francis, thank you ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Talent Titans, brought to you by Recruitment Professional Forum, where they're building a grassroots community for professionals and leaders in the recruitment industry to collaborate, advocate, and advance the profession. If you liked or were inspired by what you heard, make sure to follow, subscribe, and even leave a review. It lets more talented recruiters like you find the show. Until next time, keep on being a talent titan.